So now that we've talked about what bundles are and how they work, let's talk about what goes inside of bundles as we move our conversation over to components and services. Let's first define what exactly is a component. So first and foremost, we have a more formal definition. A component is an object that provides some sort of functionality. But practically speaking, a component is going to be expressed as a Java class inside of a bundle. And what makes a component is that it's declared as a component. We'll see how that's done pretty soon. Right. When we have a component, this object is also going to be managed within the OSGI framework. More specifically, there's a part inside of it that'll handle the component. So the OSGI framework handles the component, and it also has its own lifecycle that goes with it. The lifecycle is very simple. It's either active or activated or deactivated. Very simple component lifecycle there. So as we talked about, a component has its own lifecycle. And as we saw with the bundle, you can have methods that correspond with the lifecycle as well. So when the component is activated, there's a method that goes with it. When a component is deactivated, there's a method that goes with that as well. So we can utilize that method and do some interesting things with it if we so desire. Along with the component, you can also configure it as well. You can set specific attributes and properties to kind of control how the component works and what it does. So why components in the first place? What are some of the features of components? So first off, a component can publish itself as a service. Generally speaking, you can think of components as services, and most of the time you're going to be right. But again, we're talking about them separately, so we'll try to make a distinction there. Right, so components will register themselves, or they can be services within the OSGI container. Components can also consume or call other services as well. The component has its own very simple lifecycle, and the component is also reusable as well. So if one application is using the component, it's not always tied up. Multiple applications and multiple OSGI bundles can use the same component. And with that, as we talked about, components also have specific properties as well. Those properties can help determine what happens if multiple bundles are using the component. All right, so let's take a look at how a component is made. It's pretty straightforward here. We see a very simple Java class, and right above the public class training component, there's an annotation at component. Right? When the component is activated, the activate method is going to be called. And in this example, we're just going to print I'm active. So very simple there. So a service, when we talk about services in this conversation, we're talking about OSGI services. So in this case, when we're talking about a service, it's going to be a component that is registered inside of the OSGI container, and more specifically registered inside of this thing called the Service Registry. We'll talk about that a little bit later as well. Right. A service typically is going to be implementing a specific interface, right? And it's always going to be referenced by its interface in the OSGI container. So the service is going to be referenced by its interface in the OSGI container. And we'll take a look at what that looks like pretty soon when we take a look at more code. So a service interface, as we see here, a very simple interface, nothing out of the ordinary, nothing out of the Java world. So interface, we have a method called getName, and then we have a setName. So very simple there. Now, if we want to implement the interface as a service or an OSGI service, it's very simple, right? So start off as you would in normal Java. You create a class that's going to be implementing the interface. From there, we then implement each one of the methods of that interface. So nothing outside of what we know in the Java world. Now, what makes this an OSGI service is that component annotation once again. So we see the @component annotation right above public class, and then the service equals is telling the OSGI container that I am this type of OSGI service. So it might sound a little funny, but we're going to say this is a employee service OSGI service, or we can also say this is a employee service component. All right, so let's talk more about the service registry. So the service registry is the one responsible for keeping track of all of our OSGI services. So as we create components, these components will be published or registered to the OSGI containers service registry. Whenever we want to call an OSGI service, the service registry is the one who is going to be looking for the specific service and making sure that everything is wired together. So when we're making API calls, service registry is the one who is responsible for making sure that the right implementation or an implementation is being connected to the API. This is going to provide a loose coupling, so there's not this tightly coupled or tightly connected relationship between our interfaces or services and the implementation. Alongside of that, we can also have multiple service implementations as well. So you can have one interface with multiple implementations. All right, and whoever is calling the services, whoever's consuming the services, also has a little bit of control as to which implementation is going to be used if there's multiple of them. So let's take a look at this diagram here of a OSGI service and how the service registry plays a role in all of this. So let's first start off with the service API. So API is nothing different than what we've seen before. In this case, what's going to happen is the package that contains the interface is going to be exported. So the idea is when we export the package, it's made available throughout the OSGI container. Over in the service implementation, this is a completely separate OSGI bundle. And so we're going to bring in the package that contains the interface so that we can implement it. So the service impl brings in package A so that we can implement the interface over in service API. When we implement the interface, this is going to be implemented using a component. So the component is going to be registered over to the OSGI service registry. And in so many words, it's going to say, hey, my functionality is to implement this specific interface. So over at the client, right, the client is going to bring in the service API, and we're going to make API calls to it. As we do, the client is going to ask the service registry to look up the implementation of the interface. Now, since the service impl registered itself as the one who implements the interface, the client will get the proper implementation thanks to the service registry. All right. This next diagram here is conveying more or less the same thing. The only difference here is that we can have multiple service implementations for one single service API. So same idea. Service API, right, is going to be implemented by a service impl. In this case, we have 3 of them. Each one is going to register the component as, my functionality is to implement this specific interface. When the client makes a call to the service API, at the same time, it's going to ask the OSGI service registry for the implementation of that API. Now, using some policies and some filters, the client can then pick which specific implementation is going to be selected. Otherwise, then the whole question is going to be, well, which one is going to be picked? So we have control over that. So how do we make components within the OSGI world? There's two different ways. The way that we're going to be talking about is the main way that we'll be creating components from here on out. So the way we create components is using Declarative Services, or DS for short. So Declarative Services is quite straightforward. All we need to do is use specific Declarative Services annotations. We saw the at component a little bit ago. The pairing for the at component annotation is going to be at reference. So at reference does just that. It gets a reference of an OSGI service. So when the client makes the API call, we'll have a reference of that implementation. Okay, so let's go ahead. We're going to take a look at what it looks like using Declarative Services. So creating a component using Declarative Services is actually pretty easy. If we weren't using any tools, the hardest part would be bringing in all of the dependencies that are needed to actually make Declarative Services work. But we'll worry about that part a little bit later. So let me demonstrate how we would create a component using Declarative Services, assuming all of our dependencies are already made or already met. So I'm going to head down to my text editor down here using Sublime, and we're going to toggle this over to Java since we're developing using Java. And let's say I'm creating a class, public class, and this is going to be implementing a hello service. So we'll call this hello service impl. And then let's just say this is implementing an interface. So implements, and we'll just call the interface hello service. And we want to register this hello service impl class as a component. So it's going to be pretty simple here. All we need to do, I'll drop the public class one line, is add this annotation here, component. And for the most part, that's pretty much it. Right? There's specific elements that we're able to add to the component to further configure it and add some properties. But for the most part, this is most of the magic, just this at component annotation. We'll take a look at some of the more detailed logistics of how to create a component using Declarative Services. So pretty easy, right? Making a component is quite straightforward, nothing too special. So with that being said, let's take a look at some of the tools that can help us along the way within our journey of OSGI. So one of the tools that we have is called BND tools. So BND is kind of the shorthand for bundle. So think of it as a tool that helps us make bundles. So BND tools. So BND tools helps us by taking care of a lot of the configuration behind the scenes. It itself is a configuration tool. And so one of the hard parts of creating a bundle is having to deal with the manifest file, and more specifically, all of the headers within that manifest file, as well as a couple of other details. But thanks to BND tools, we can say goodbye to a lot of the nitty-gritty of messing with the manifest file and its headers. BND tools will take care of a lot of that for us. So we don't really need to worry about writing XML declarations. We don't really need to worry about service-related manifest headers or service registration code. A lot of the writing that used to have to be done is going to be taken care of using BND tools. So we've seen how to create components, and we've seen now how BND tools is going to help us out along the way. So with all that being said, let's take a recap or review of some of the key aspects and key components that we've talked about so far. So first part is going to be the API or the interface, right? Just defining what methods we're going to be able to call. Right? With the API, we need to implement it somehow. And so we'll have our own implementation class helping us implement it. And as we do, we're going to be implementing it using a component so that this will be registered within OSGI Service Registry so it can keep track of which APIs are implemented by which components. Okay. When we create components, it's pretty simple. We just use the at component annotation. When we want to call a service in the OSGI world, the way we do so is using the @reference annotation. So we see here the @reference annotation towards the bottom as we instantiate or create this employee service object. So employee service object is created based off of the employee service interface. @reference asks the service registry to get the OSGI service that implements employee service. So that way, when we make the service call here in the return statement, right, it's going to work. There's an implementation there that'll handle the details and the logistics. So with all that being said, let's go ahead and take a look at what our exercise is going to be looking like. So we're going to work on this together. We're going to create an OSGI service with the help of Declarative Services as well as B&D tools. Let's take a look at all the logistics of what this exercise is going to be dealing with. So as with any service that we have seen so far, there's going to be at least two big aspects that we need to take care of. The first one is we need to create the interface. The second one is we need to create the implementation of the interface by creating a component. As we do that, we're going to be taking a look at how B&D tools is really going to help us out along the way. We won't really need to worry too much about the manifest file and its headers, as B&D tools is the one who's going to really do a lot of the heavy lifting. As we traverse around that, we'll also again solidify the idea of the service registry and kind of what's happening behind the scenes. All right. So with that, we're going to go through 5 big steps here, right? So we're going to create a B&D OSGI project. From there, we'll create the interface, implement the interface, and then we'll create a command interpreter service component. This is more or less going to be the client that's going to call the service. And then once we have those 3 things created, we'll go ahead and test this out and see it in action within the GoGo shell.